light on. Imagine you're sitting in the cockpit of an F-35 Lightning II. It's 3:40 in the morning. You're somewhere over Eastern Europe. The sky is black, the ground invisible below. The systems show green. The synthetic aperture radar is operating. The NATO data link is transmitting. Sensor fusion is integrated and working. You are, technically, the pilot of the most advanced combat aircraft in history. And then, within minutes, something changes. It's not an explosion. It's not a missile. The data link begins to degrade. The MADL loses coherence with the aircraft at your flank. The integrated logistics system begins to report status failures you've never seen before. You're in the air, with an aircraft whose development cost $400 billion, and what's compromising your mission isn't a weapon. It's information, or rather, the absence of it. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand why defense analysts, electronic warfare experts, and NATO intelligence officers are quietly asking a question that nobody wants to answer in public. Did China hand Russia the architectural blueprint to paralyze NATO's F-35 fleet in the air? The answer isn't in a single dramatic event. It's in a convergence of more than a decade that you need to see as a whole to understand what's really at stake. We're going to build this analysis layer by layer, starting with the architecture of risk, and ending with the indicators that will put you ahead of the news cycle. This is not a simulation. This is not speculation. This is the most important air security problem of our generation. What most people understand about the F-35 is that it's an advanced fighter. Stealthy, fast, powerful. That's technically correct, but it's completely wrong as a strategic framing. To understand what's at risk in this story, you need to stop thinking of the F-35 as an airplane. Start thinking of it as the single node of an air network that spans an entire alliance. In practice, the scenario is this. 13 NATO member nations operate or have ordered the F-35. United States, United Kingdom, Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Italy, Poland, Finland, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Israel. More than 890 units ordered or delivered. The development program exceeded $400 billion. There is no other asset in Western defense architecture that concentrates this amount of doctrinal dependency on a single platform. NATO's air superiority doctrine wasn't built around the F-35. It was built inside it. Sensor fusion, the ability to integrate data from radar, infrared, electronic, and external systems into a unified tactical image, depends on F-35 specific software. The MADL data link, the multifunction advanced data link, operates in K-band frequency between 26.5 and 40 GHz, creating a stealthy communication network between allied aircraft. Without this link functioning, the collective tactical coordination that makes the F-35 superior to any fifth-generation equivalent simply disappears. And this is the problem that CSIS analysts identified with increasing clarity. NATO has no equivalent European alternative. The Eurofighter Typhoon is an excellent fourth-generation aircraft, but operates under a completely different doctrine. The French Rafale is capable, but doesn't integrate with the F-35's sensor fusion architecture. When 13 nations bet their collective air superiority on a single platform, they are creating, by definition, a point of concentration of vulnerability. The analyst who tells you the F-35 is the most advanced airplane in the world is saying something true. The analyst who tells you NATO created a unique architectural dependency on a platform whose internal systems were compromised before it even entered operation is saying something more important and more urgent. Return to the question this video started with. What does it take to paralyze an entire fleet without sinking a single aircraft? The answer begins in the late 2000s, and it begins with a theft. In 2007, analysts in the American government's intelligence community began detecting patterns of data exfiltration directed at subcontractors of the Joint Strike Fighter program, the project that would become the F-35. It wasn't an opportunistic attack. It was a surgical, patient, and systematic campaign. The units behind it were later associated with APT-40 and APT-10 operations, linked to Unit 61398 of China's People's Liberation Army. Between 2007 and 2009, more than 50,000 pages of F-35 program design documents were exfiltrated. Exhaust cooling system data, motor schematics, radar cross-section data, the exact geometry that determines the aircraft's stealth profile, sensor specifications, and, what matters most for this analysis, data on the data link architecture and frequency characteristics of the aircraft's communication systems. At this point, most analyses of this incident make the mistake that will exact its price later. The conventional framing is, China stole the F-35 plans to copy the aircraft, which is why the J-20 looks like an F-35. You've probably read this version. Yes, the J-20 Chengdu made its first flight in 2011, faster than analysts expected. Yes, there are documented design parallels that were raised after its public debut in 2015. This framing is a distraction. The strategically relevant question is not, did China copy the F-35 to build an equivalent aircraft? The question is, what does an adversary who has 50,000 pages of technical specifications of an adversary aircraft decide to do with that knowledge when they are not trying to replicate the aircraft, but trying to defeat it? The Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS, extensively documented the cyber espionage campaign of the JSF program. Warzone produced technical analyses of what was specifically compromised. Testimonies to Congress, including from Lockheed Martin and Air Force officials, confirmed the scale of the exfiltration and the nature of the lost data. What came out of those servers was not just an aircraft design, it was a map of vulnerabilities, an inventory of where the system is weakest, of which frequencies can be exploited, of what architectural dependencies exist within the most critical platform of the Western Alliance. Analysts from CSIS and the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, independently reached a similar conclusion. China did not need to build a better F-35. It needed to fully understand the F-35. And between 2007 and 2009, it obtained what it needed. The theft, in itself, is an anchor fact, but a map of vulnerabilities is not a weapon. To become operational capability, it must go through a process of analysis, research, and doctrinal development. And this is where the element of this story enters, that most Western analysts systematically underestimated because it was in plain sight all along. The answer has a name: Project 985. In 1998, the Chinese government launched an initiative called Project 985, in reference to the year and month of the inaugural speech, September 1998. The stated goal was to elevate a group of Chinese universities to the level of the world's best institutions: Tsinghua, Peking University, University of Science and Technology of China. The list includes 39 elite institutions distributed throughout the country. This was not a clandestine operation. It was announced publicly. It was financed explicitly. The universities received massive investments in research infrastructure, international faculties, and global partnerships. If you had looked for information about Project 985 in 2005, you would find academic papers, government announcements, and consulting analyses praising the modernization of Chinese higher education. And it is precisely this that makes Project 985 so fascinating as a strategic mechanism. China's civil-military fusion doctrine, known as CMF, formally integrates Project 985 institutions into the development of capabilities of the People's Liberation Army. The flow is bidirectional. Research, personnel, and intellectual output from elite universities flow to PLA R&D units. PLA operational requirements inform academic research agendas. The firewall between civilian science and military application that exists, at least structurally, in Western democracies simply does not exist in Chinese architecture. The concrete pipeline works like this. Research in electromagnetic systems and signal processing at Project 985 universities feeds into CETC, the China Electronics Technology Group Corporation, the country's largest defense electronics conglomerate. CETC develops operational electronic warfare systems for PLA units. These systems are then tested, refined, and in some cases transferred as doctrine to strategic partners. The research domains that became critical for exploiting F-35 vulnerabilities are all present in the published agendas of Project 985 universities. K-band signal analysis, where the F-35's MADIEL precisely operates. Anti-stealth radars, designed to detect aircraft with stealth geometry. Data link interception techniques, studying how to disrupt or spoof high-frequency communication systems between aircraft in joint operations. You don't need to infer this from secret operations. You can read the titles of papers published in Chinese academic journals between 2010 and 2020. Project 985 was not a cover for an intelligence operation. It was something more sophisticated, an institutional system that converts stolen intelligence into operational capability using the most difficult mechanism to track and challenge that exists: open publication academic research with implicit military application. China built the exploit within universities, in broad daylight, and the final product was electronic warfare doctrine that knows exactly where the F-35 is most vulnerable. But vulnerable how? To answer that with precision, you need to understand what Alice and Odin really are, and why defense analysts call them the true Achilles heel of the F-35 program. There is a question that defense cybersecurity experts increasingly ask. What if the F-35's greatest vulnerability was not the aircraft itself, not the engine, not the radar, not the stealth airframe, the logistics system? Consider this for a moment, because this is where the arithmetic of vulnerability becomes precise. ALIS, Autonomic Logistics Information System, was developed as the operational backbone of the entire F-35 fleet of the Alliance. In 2023, its successor, the Odin, Operational Data Integrated Network, assumed that role. But the central architecture remains the same: a centralized, cloud-connected platform that manages maintenance scheduling, parts supply chain, mission readiness data, and flight records for every F-35 in the Alliance. Every aircraft, every pilot, every mission. Odin is not an auxiliary system. It is the central nervous system of the fleet. Without it functioning within expected parameters, an F-35 can fly, but it cannot be efficiently maintained within the operational standards that its employment doctrine requires. Mission readiness, which the U.S. Air Force targets above 80%, depends directly on the integrity of Odin. At this stage, the analysis becomes surgical. If an adversary cannot shoot down an F-35, technically difficult, logistically costly, but can degrade the integrity of Odin for the fleets of multiple allied nations simultaneously, what happens? The aircraft remain physically intact, the pilots remain trained, but the collective operational readiness of the Alliance collapses without a single shot being fired. There doesn't need to be an aerial battle to win the air war. MADL adds another layer of exposure. Operating on K-band frequency between 26.5 and 40 GHz, MADL is what allows F-35s from different nations to share tactical data in real time, in a stealthy manner, without emissions detectable by conventional methods. The frequency characteristics and waveform of this system are a target of the highest intelligence value. An adversary that knows the exact specifications can attempt directed jamming, spoofing, or interception, effects that are not visible as kinetic warfare acts, but that functionally degrade the tactical superiority that the platform promises. And the data that anchors the scale of the problem. The F-35 program depends on more than 1,500 suppliers in 45 American states and multiple allied nations. The attack surface is not a system. It is a network that spans an entire continent, with entry points distributed across dozens of jurisdictions with different cybersecurity standards. The vulnerability of the F-35 is not insufficient stealth. It is systemic dependence on a centralized logistics platform and a geographically dispersed supply network, both readable by an adversary that has spent more than a decade studying specifically where the failure points are located. Now, the central question of this analysis: how does this intelligence developed in China cross what some analysts call the doctrinal corridor between Beijing and Moscow? How does the map of F-35 vulnerabilities reach the hands of those in position to operationalize it against NATO? The answer lies in what happened after February 2022. At this very moment, as you watch this video, there exists a cooperation between the People's Liberation Army and the GRU, Russian military intelligence, that most conventional analyses underestimate. The conventional framing is, China and Russia have common interests, but they are not formal allies. This is technically correct. But it is analytically inadequate as a framework for understanding what is happening between the military structures of the two countries. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, military technical cooperation between the PLA and GRU deepened in ways documented in high-quality open sources. Vostok 2022 exercises included significant participation of PLA forces in the largest joint maneuver context since the end of the Cold War. Intelligence sharing agreements reported by IISS and the Institute for the Study of War, the ISW, describe electronic warfare coordination in the context of the Russian campaign in Ukraine. The CNIS, Center for a New American Security, published analyses on the expansion of military technical cooperation in 2023 and 2024. What Russia brings to this exchange is irreplaceable. Operational experience in deploying electronic warfare in real combat environment. Electromagnetic spectrum data from a battlefield where Western systems are being tested live. And adaptive doctrinal iteration based on what works against American and European electronics in real operational conditions. What China brings is equally distinct. The architecture of F-35 vulnerability, developed over a decade of intelligence analysis and directed academic research. Sensor specifications, MADL parameters, mapping of Odin dependencies. The final product of a systematic process that began with 50,000 pages of exfiltrated documents. This is not a story about two countries sharing weapons. It is about one country that mapped the vulnerability and another that is positioned to exploit it. And the corridor between them is not geographic. It is doctrinal. The transfer of capability did not occur in a single event. There is no flash drive being handed over at some clandestine meeting. The mechanism is harder to contest because it is harder to prove. It is a continuous exchange of doctrine, data, and personnel between two military structures that have complementary incentives to see NATO's air dominance architecture degraded. The arithmetic of alignment is simple. China wants deterrence against American air capabilities in the Asia-Pacific. Russia wants to degrade NATO's air response on the European eastern flank. One adversary with the map, another with the opportunity to use it. The question this analysis must now answer is, who within NATO is most exposed to this convergence? The question is not theoretical. It is geographic, operational, and immediate. 13 nations operate the F-35 within NATO's structure. The degree of exposure for each is not identical. It depends on geographic location, fleet size, integration with Odin, and cybersecurity standards of national support infrastructure. The United States operates the largest fleet and has the most robust cybersecurity resources, but also has the largest volume of critical missions where degradation of Odin or MADL would have immediate consequences for global force projection operations. American risk is one of scale. The United Kingdom operates F-35Bs in an embarked configuration on Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers. This adds a specific layer of complexity. Interference with Odin for an embarked fleet has direct implications for naval power projection in any crisis involving the North Atlantic or Mediterranean. British risk is one of projection. The Netherlands and Norway are cases of particular attention. Both have F-35 fleets positioned on NATO's northern flank, in proximity to the Arctic and the Baltic, the most probable axes of maneuver in any escalation involving Russia. Norway was one of the first international operators and has advanced integration with Odin, which maximizes both operational efficiency and the surface of vulnerability. Nordic risk is one of positioning. Poland is the most acute case in this analysis. With F-35s in direct deployment on NATO's eastern flank, in territory that borders Belarus and has access to the Suwalki corridor, Poland operates its aircraft in the most contested electromagnetic environment in the alliance. An adversary with the capability to degrade Odin or MADL would have maximum impact precisely where NATO needs maximum operational readiness. Polish risk is one of the frontier. But there is a coordination problem that amplifies all these individual risks. 13 nations, one platform. Divergent cybersecurity standards for national support infrastructure. Each nation's Odin systems are implementations of the same central architecture, but managed with different national resources and standards. The weakest link in the Odin security chain of the alliance, is not the central system managed by Lockheed Martin and the U.S. Department of Defense. It is the support implementation with the fewest resources among the 13 partner nations. And if Russia manages to degrade the operational coherence of the F-35 for 1, 2, or 3 allied nations simultaneously, not necessarily the most powerful, but the most geographically exposed, what happens to the Article 5 calculation? NATO's collective defense guarantee functions as a deterrent because it assumes the alliance can respond with collective force. If the most critical element of the aerial superiority doctrine of this collective response is operationally degraded, the calculation changes. Not speculatively, operationally. The question that remains is this theoretical, or has Russia already demonstrated the capacity to degrade Western electronic systems in real combat? The answer to this question closes the loop we opened at the beginning of this video. The F-35 cockpit scenario that opened this video was not hypothetical. It was a composite of documented effects that Russia has already achieved against Western electronic systems in active combat. The data proves it. On the Ukrainian battlefield, Russia has deployed a progressive electronic warfare strategy that analysts from IISS and Warzone describe as the most sophisticated live EW laboratory operating in the world today. The result has been systematic and measurable. JDAM munitions, Joint Direct Attack munitions, are GPS-guided bombs that the U.S. Air Force and Allied forces rely on as standard precision ammunition. After transfer to Ukraine, JDAM began to show significant precision degradation in real-world use environment. The cause? Russian GPS jamming sophisticated enough to degrade the navigation signal of the bombs in flight. Warzone reported cases of JDAMs impacting targets with error margins of hundreds of meters, rendering them ineffective for the purpose they were designed for. Excalibur rounds, high-precision GPS-guided artillery ammunition, showed even more dramatic results. In 2023, reporting from the New York Times and analysis from IISS documented the dramatic drop in Excalibur effectiveness in Ukraine, directly attributed to Russian GPS jamming. The effectiveness rate, which exceeded 90% in previous environments, fell to less than 10% in some sectors of the battlefield. The Krasuka 4 system operates with an effective range of approximately 300 kilometers. Its specific design is to suppress ISR systems, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, including unmanned aircraft and surveillance platforms. The Murmansk BN operates in the HF band with a documented range of over 5,000 kilometers, designed for long-distance communications disruption. The combination of these two systems creates an electromagnetic suppression architecture that ranges from the tactical to the strategic. What these systems collectively demonstrate is not an isolated jamming capability. It is a doctrine, an adaptive, progressive, and systematic approach to degrading Western electronics in real combat environments, beginning with commercially available GPS signals, evolving to military-grade weapon systems, and iterating based on what works against each specific category of system. CNAS analysts describe this progression straightforwardly. Russia is not theorizing about electronic warfare. It is practicing. It is collecting data. It is learning. And the central question is not whether this doctrine is sufficiently sophisticated to threaten the F-35. It is whether, combined with the map of specific vulnerabilities developed by a decade of Chinese analysis, this doctrine now has the precise parameters necessary to be directed against the most critical platform of the Western alliance. The question left open at the beginning of the video is now answered with evidence, not speculation. The capability exists. The doctrine exists. The real-world combat iteration exists. What the analysis needs to deliver now is the synthesis. Return to the question with which this video began. Not just the question of the F-35 cockpit, although that is the image you will carry with you. The analytical question: what does it take to paralyze an entire fleet without sinking a single aircraft? You now have the complete framework to answer it. And more than that, you have the set of indicators that will allow you to monitor how this story unfolds. The threat that this video documented is not a single event. It is a three-layered campaign, built over more than a decade, that converged on a verifiable strategic risk point. The first layer is intelligence. Between 2007 and 2009, cyber operations linked to the People's Liberation Army exfiltrated more than 50,000 pages of F-35 program documentation. Not to copy the aircraft, to map its vulnerabilities, MADL frequency specifications, ALS dependencies, supply chain failure architecture, with more than 1,500 suppliers distributed across an entire continent. This is what intelligence analysts call target architectural mapping. The second layer is research. Project 985, through the civil-military fusion doctrine, created an institutional pipeline that converted this intelligence into electronic warfare operational doctrine. K-band signal analysis, stealth defeating radar, data link interception techniques. All developed at public universities, published in academic journals, and delivered to CETC and PLA-EW units. The speed at which this layer moved, from raw intelligence to applied research to operational capability, is what makes Project 985 the central mechanism of this story. The third layer is deployment. Deep PLA-GRU cooperation after 2022 created the conduit through which the doctrine developed in China can be positioned in Russia as operational capability. Russia brings experience of real electronic combat environment. China brings the vulnerability architecture. The exchange is continuous, doctrinal, and more difficult to contest than any single documentable transfer event. What this analysis does not assert is that a single dramatic transfer event occurred and is documented in open sources. What it asserts is that the convergence of three verified elements, data exfiltration at scale, a decade-long military academic pipeline, documented doctrinal cooperation, constitutes a plausible and serious strategic risk that merits analytical attention based on available evidence, not dismissal or speculation. These are the concrete indicators you should monitor in the coming weeks and months. The engagement behavior of the J-20 versus F-35 in future exercises, especially in fifth-generation confrontation scenarios that China is accelerating. Cybersecurity incidents involving Odin infrastructure in NATO partner nations, particularly in lower-resource national implementations. Documented evolution of Russian EW capabilities toward K-band frequencies, which is where MADL operates. Scope of joint PLA-Russia exercises with explicit electronic warfare components after Vostok 2022. The vulnerability that was mapped between 2007 and 2009 cannot be unmapped. The data are in adversary hands. The architecture already exists. What is still possible to determine, and what this analysis will continue to monitor, is whether doctrine became deployment. There is a convenient narrative structure for stories of espionage and cyber warfare. A single dramatic event, a specific date, a transfer that changes everything. This narrative is easy to tell and easy to contest. The real story of how China built and delivered to Russia the architectural map to degrade NATO's F-35 fleet, does not have this structure. It is the story of a visible and publicly funded academic system that converts military intelligence into electronic warfare capability. It is the story of an architectural dependency that NATO built consciously, because the F-35 is indeed the best fifth-generation platform available. It is the story of cooperation between two countries that are not formal allies, but have complementary strategic incentives to see the West vulnerable in the air. And it is the story of a Russia that is not just theoretically positioned to exploit this vulnerability. It is doctrinally prepared, operationally tested in real combat in Ukraine, and potentially equipped with the exact specifications of MADL and Odin that make the difference between generic jamming and surgical targeted jamming. This story is not over. It is ongoing. And the next indicators that will either confirm or refute this analysis will appear in exercises, in incident reports, and in the capability data that the coming weeks will produce. Keep watching, stay informed, because this story is far from over. If you want to continue following this analysis, subscribe to the channel now. The next video goes straight to the next point of this architecture, what NATO planners already know, and what they're building in response. Watch the video on screen right now, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.